Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm just going to maybe fix this a little bit. So today we're going to be talking about racism, allyship, and mental health. There's been a lot of stuff going on in the world, but this is not new to us. This has been going on for centuries and centuries, and it's great that attention is being brought to it today, but maybe a little bit late to the conversation. So what we're going to do today is explore what racism is, how it affects people, ways that we can step up to be allies. Um, as we do this, one of the things that I think is important to recognize is that we all exist as individuals with a lot of different types of identity. And so the first thing I'm going to do is introduce myself. So my name is Dr. Taslim Alani-Verjee, and I am the founder and director of SILM Center for Mental Health. I am also a clinical psychologist. That's the title. That's the professional Taslim. But there's more to it than just that. So who am I? I'd like to walk us through a little bit of a journey of how I got to know myself and my different identities. And while this may seem like a little bit of a long-winded, circular way of getting to who I am, it's important, and I promise I will tell you why. So, probably from the earliest age I can remember, I knew I was a girl. I knew I was a girl because people told me I was a girl. They reminded me regularly that I was a girl. So there was no getting away from that. But that was pretty much the center of my identity, was being a girl. As I got a little bit older, probably in around grade 3 or grade 4, I came to learn and to recognize that my parents were immigrants and refugees, so that my history of being in Canada was different than the history of other people being in Canada. And the way that that would be brought to my attention was, for example, when I mispronounced words or didn't understand certain euphemisms, or when I didn't know certain traditions or cultural concepts as the people in my classes did. And so that was brought to my attention probably in around grade 3 or grade 4. It was probably in grade 7 or grade 8 that attention was brought to the fact that I'm Muslim. Now, of course, I knew that I was a girl. I knew that I was the child of immigrants and refugees. I knew that I was Muslim, but these things weren't brought to the center of my identity until certain points of time. So, um, grade 7 or grade 8, around the time of 9/11 or right after that, and conversations that happened at school, and it was brought to my attention that I was Muslim and people saw me as Muslim. It was when I was in high school that I came to learn that I was brown. Um, and that was often through uh, other kids at school being around a lot more diversity in my high school. And I remember playing tabla on the lockers and listening to Bollywood music with my friends at school. And um, even though I didn't understand Bollywood music because I don't speak Hindi, that was how I attached myself to my brownness. It was it was all of these things that came together that allowed me to understand parts of my identity, but it was interesting that I also came to recognize that people didn't necessarily see me as I saw myself until I was in grad school, and I was sitting in a women's studies class with 6 other lovely women, and we were talking about diversity and women of color and their experiences. And it was a question that came up, and everyone in my class, including my instructor, looked at me for a perspective. Now, I didn't know the perspective of all women of color. How could I know? It's not necessarily even something that I would have spoken about, but yet I was expected to know. And that's when I realized that people didn't see me the way I saw myself. I saw myself as an individual in a classroom, ready to learn, ready with the same kinds of experiences as everyone else, and yet everyone else saw me differently. As I've grown up, I've started to learn that people don't necessarily take me as seriously as other people. And it's about learning that even within the subsets of being a woman, of being the child of immigrants and refugees, of being Muslim, of being brown, of being the age that I am, sometimes I don't even belong in those subsets because our identities are complex and they're multiple and they come together in intersectional ways. And sometimes that means that we fit in, and that means we have so much more community. And sometimes it means that we don't quite fit into any of those communities. Now, as a brown woman, I recognize that I have privilege and I experience oppression. It's both of those things. I also have privilege as an educated individual, as someone who can trust that I can always find employment, as someone who can confidently talk about my identity, including all of its complexities, like I'm doing right now, without the fear of persecution. Not everyone can say those things. And so for me, living this life has both experiences of oppression and marginalization, as well as experiences of privilege. Now, the reason why I wanted to start with that is because as we explore racism and as we explore allyship, it's so important to recognize that we are not just one identity. Every single one of us is made up of so many different identities. And if we're going to try to be allies, we need to recognize each of those identities and how each of those identities play a role in who we are and how the world sees us and how we see the world. Because if we don't recognize those things, if we just see ourselves as one person with one single identity, then we don't give space to the multiplicity of that. We make it a lot more simple than it really is. And in that process, we end up buying into the system that we either fit into a category or we don't. And so I start with this so that you can all engage in your own exercise of thinking about your identities and thinking about how they fit in, how they work, and how you want to make sense of them. So now let's talk about racism. Racism, if we look in the dictionary as of probably 2 days ago, included the idea that racism is racial prejudice or discrimination. And so this is not just any kind of racial prejudice or discrimination because it is rooted in something. And if we ignore the rooted in something part, then anyone can experience racism. But this is not the case because racism is rooted in systemic oppression, which means that some of us benefit from this system while others do not. It is the intentional disadvantaging of groups of people based on race or really anything else if we're talking about systemic oppression while advantaging members of the dominant group. And so this is why when we talk about racism, not everyone experiences racism because not everyone is disadvantaged in the same way. And some people are constantly benefiting from racism while some people are constantly not. And so we need to recognize that there is a power imbalance here. It's not simply a one-on-one interaction in which someone feels offended or someone feels targeted based on the color of their skin. There are layers to this and layers of history and foundation in which some groups have been disadvantaged. Now, what does this look like? So racism can include macroaggressions, which are overt. So it might be the calling of names or racial slurs. It might be being denied a job that was intentionally based on race, or denied rent, or being able to rent a place, being denied boarding a plane because of the color of one's skin. These are overt if they're made to be known that these decisions were made because of race. However, the way we more often see it is in microaggressions. And microaggressions are more subtle and sometimes they're unintentional, sometimes they're intentional. And so if we think about some of these more subtle microaggressions, it might be, for example, being surprised that someone is articulate or was able to complete the amount of school that they completed. It might be being surprised that someone doesn't like hip hop music or doesn't know Bollywood music or doesn't care to enjoy it. It could be all sorts of surprises, and these surprises happen because when we think about people, people categorize us. People categorize all of us, and when we don't fit their model of what they expected, they are surprised by this as though anything outside of that is outside of the concept of what it means to be that thing. And so when we as individuals work to categorize people, I mean, this is the way we make sense of the world. From a very young age, we categorize, and there's nothing wrong with these categories. However, when we stick people into the categories and we don't give room for the multiplicity or the complexity of identities, this is where it becomes problematic. And then when we judge people based on those categories so that all of the people within that group fall within certain characteristics or certain traits or are more likely to engage in certain behavior, this is where it becomes problematic. And then when we discriminate based on that, this is even more problematic. And so it's not simply that we exist as individuals, because when we look a certain way or when we act a certain way, we fall into categories, and that's all that people can see. And this is what makes racism so problematic, is that when we interact with people, usually the first thing we notice is someone's physical appearance, and often that includes their skin color. And so based on a person's skin color, we categorize, and then if we have inflexibility in that categorization, it's problematic. So it's important to remember that all of this comes from prejudice, and prejudice is a prejudgment, right? So we exist in a world of judgment and of stereotypes. And again, this is how we make sense of the world around us. So this in and of itself isn't necessarily bad, but we have to learn how to challenge these judgments, right? And so when we learn and train ourselves to challenge the assumptions that we make, to challenge the stereotypes that have been taught to us, then we can start to recognize that some of these things are wrong. Some of these things we've been socialized with, but are inaccurate and are actually hurtful to others. So none of us are immune to it, but when we can challenge it, this is when we start to do the real work. And it takes work. And this is what we'll talk about when we talk about allyship. I also should have probably mentioned earlier, you are welcome to ask questions, and they will show up in the chat box. And so we will be going through questions in case anyone has any, and they will come directly to me, so they won't be seen by everyone else. I just turned that feature on. And so if you do have questions, please feel free to ask them as we go on. So let's switch gears to talk about the mental health effects of racism. So one of the first things we think about, if we throw away all of the diagnostic labels and we just talk about what happens when someone is experiencing racism. Number one, people feel like they don't have control. We're often socialized to think that we live in a bit of a meritocratic society. So if we work hard, if we're dedicated, if we're good people, good things will happen and we'll get access to the opportunities that we should get access to. However, when you're experiencing racism, this isn't the way the world works for you, because no matter how hard you work, no matter how successful you are, people see you in a certain way. Again, they're putting you in that category, and that category may be as a person who is violent or suspicious, or who doesn't know how to drive properly, or will have an accent, or who won't know how to spell. All of these things, these categories, and it may end there, but it may not, right? It may also mean that because of those categories, you're more likely to be discriminated against. You're more likely to experience violence. You're more likely to be targeted. And so no matter how much you try to be a good person or control the environment or do the things you're supposed to do, you have no control over anything. And this can be really, really, really hard for people. And so lack of control, when we think about it, can lead to feelings of anxiety. It can lead to sometimes what we call learned helplessness, which is basically this idea that you have no control over the threats that are going to come at you. And so you give up on trying to control anything at all. And you'll constantly feel targeted and victimized. Now, some of this is real because of the reality of the situation, but then some of it is also the psychological concept that is formed through repeated experiences, and not necessarily even directed at you, but also directed to people who fall into the same category as you. The other thing that can happen is what we call internalization. And this is when we start to internalize the messages that others use to talk about us. And so, for example, if it is that we are more violent, or we are aggressive, or we don't know how to maintain good relationships, we start to tell ourselves these messages. And when we internalize it, that means that we think that we're just as bad as other people think that we are. We might start to enact some of these things thinking that there's no other choice in the matter. This is the path that's been set out to us because this is the way that we were born. Of course, this isn't true. But when we internalize these messages, then we start to live them out. The other thing that can happen is that we create distance. And so, for example, I know growing up, and I am okay to acknowledge this because I know that I'm not perfect, but growing up, one of the things that I used to do is that when I would see someone at the store who spoke with an accent, I would physically create space between myself and that person. And the reason why is because I didn't want to be categorized as that other. Um, I know better now, but when we internalize racism and when we internalize discrimination, one of the things we might try to do is make ourselves feel better, feel less like other people. And so when we create that space, that's a way of protecting ourselves from the discrimination that those other people might experience. Now, to everyone else, I'm just the same person as that other brown person with an accent. People don't see it necessarily as differently, but that's one of the ways that we might protect ourselves. We see this, for example, in what we call shadeism, where individuals of lighter skin and softer hair are generally considered to be better. They generally have more opportunities. And this is, again, ways that we internalize and then create distance as a way of protecting ourselves. The other thing that might happen is what we call avoidance of valued action. Now, avoidance of valued action occurs when we learn or we decide that no matter what we do or where we go, we're not going to see success and we're not going to be happy. And so if we, for example, enjoy going to certain stores or certain restaurants or hanging out with certain people, but in those efforts and in those behaviors, we continue to experience discrimination, we continue to feel targeted, we continue to feel unsafe, as any of us would, we stop going to those places and we stop talking to those people because we're trying to keep ourselves safe. This is a very normal and adaptive thing. But when it happens over and over and over again, what happens to our options? We start experiencing fewer and fewer and fewer options because there are fewer and fewer and fewer places that are safe for us. And so then we stop living the life that we want to live. And this too is problematic because what is the sense of living a life when you can't do the things that are important to you and you can't do the things that are meaningful to you? You can't interact with the people who you want to be interacting with. And this makes it really hard to live a meaningful and successful life. We can also talk about anxiety, right? When you're constantly watchful, when you're constantly worried about being targeted, no matter what you're doing, this is naturally going to create anxiety because there is something legitimate to be feared. We might experience hypervigilance, which is that watchfulness or being on guard, constantly watching your shoulder, making sure that people don't misunderstand you or perceive you incorrectly, watching your tone of voice, self-monitoring to make sure that you're constantly portraying yourself as someone, for example, who is educated or who is non-threatening or who has the potential to be successful. Whatever these things are, they're things that we do to try to protect ourselves. Then there's also the physiological responses to stress. And so when we think about someone who is constantly on guard, constantly feeling like they're at risk of being threatened, right, their heart rates are constantly up, their bodies are constantly tense, their bodies are releasing cortisol. This puts people at risk of heart disease, of digestive problems, of chronic illnesses, of early death. And so it's not just a psychological thing, but it's how those psychological factors then play into the physical factors to actually affect people's quality of life and their longevity. When people of color, when Black folks, when Indigenous folks are trying to access treatment, when they're trying to seek help, some of the barriers that happen are that people feel judged or misunderstood. And this can happen frequently because, especially when you're seeing a therapist who doesn't necessarily look like you or who might not have the same life experience as you, you might feel as though they don't understand. And sometimes they might not. And so we might feel like we have to explain things. We may feel shame for not being tougher or more resilient in how we deal with things. We may think that that complaining about things might be a burden on the person, or that they might think that we're making a big deal about something that isn't actually that important. And so a lot of people choose not to seek out formal supports through, for example, therapy, but even going to family doctors. If we look at the research for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, they don't seek out any kind of treatment as much as white folks. And the reason why is because they have worse experiences. There are histories of mistrust and of being taken advantage of. And so why would people trust institutions that have historically not taken care of them? We see that when we talk about the dispensing of medication, of the assessment of mental illness, of the assessment of anything related physically or mentally. Some people are just less likely to be taken seriously and to be taken at face value. And this is because of their physical appearance. And so it's not just in people's heads, it's also in how they are treated and the experiences of how they are treated. So this stuff is real. Some of the ways that we can try to combat the mental health effects of racism include living a valued life. So this is, while recognizing that the world may be unpredictable and the world may be unsafe, we can still live the life that we want. Now, of course, this has to be a balanced approach, and what that balanced approach is for each and every single one of us will be a little bit different. However, we can try to think about the things that are important to us and continue to pursue them. We can think about the relationships that are important to us and continue to pursue them. And we might start to find that some of those things can be a little bit safer, and some of those things just aren't working for us. And so we can continue to decide and to negotiate and to navigate all of that. However, when we can choose and commit to living a life that is of our values and of important to us and that brings meaning to us, that can increase our quality of life, and that can help protect us from the mental health effects of racism. We can also attend to our emotions. Now, unfortunately, so many of us are socialized to believe that we're not supposed to acknowledge unpleasant emotions. So if we're feeling sad or we're crying, we're told to toughen up. If we're angry, we're told to just let it go. And these things aren't helpful. This kind of feedback isn't helpful, but often we train ourselves to give ourselves this feedback as well. And so some of the things that we can try to do is to actually give space to those emotions and to give ourselves the opportunity to feel them, to make sense of them, to process them, to just let them be so that we can connect from them and we can learn from them. This doesn't mean it's a pleasant experience. However, the more that we can do that, the less we shut ourselves down, the less we doubt ourselves when we experienced a microaggression, and the more we can feel whatever we're feeling and decide what we're going to do about it. But when we're stuck in the anger, or we're stuck in the rejecting of the anger, because we're just supposed to be stronger, we're supposed to be able to deal with this stuff, then we don't give ourselves the opportunity to really feel and to think about how those experiences and how those situations affect us. The other thing that we can do is practice self-compassion. Now, self-compassion may have a bit of a bad reputation of being fluffy, but at the end of the day, life is hard for a lot of us, and for some of us it's harder, and for some of us it's easier. And again, we have to consider the complexity of all of our identities when we think about how hard life is for us. But life is hard, no matter what. And so giving ourselves space to recognize that it's okay if we're not 100% every single day, that we don't need to put in 150 just to be taken at 80. These are the things that we can practice in order to not put so much pressure on ourselves and to recognize that we all have different needs at different times. Being able to recognize that and give ourselves what we need helps us be more resilient. It helps us navigate these tough situations, and it helps us be more effective in this world. Again, this world is not necessarily kind. Actually, it's just not kind, not necessarily. It's not kind. And for many of us, it's less kind. And so when we can recognize that this is not about us, that we didn't make that situation happen, but that we can still take care of ourselves regardless of who caused that situation, even if it wasn't okay, that's taking care of ourselves. That's self-compassion, and that allows for healing. Now, let's talk about allyship. First, what is allyship? Allyship is a lifelong process of building relationships based on trust, based on consistency, and based on accountability. And these relationships happen with marginalized individuals or groups. And so it's not just something that happens overnight. These are relationships that are built over time. They take commitment, they take thought. And it starts with recognizing our power and our privilege. And this is why I started with the story of who I am, because with that story comes power and comes privilege and also comes marginalization and also comes oppression, because we are not one, we are so many. And so when we can recognize our power and our privilege, we can understand how we can navigate our relationships with other people. Allyship includes standing up for what is right, but in ways that respect the voices and the spaces of those who are experiencing oppression. And so standing up is great, right? Using your voice is great to stand up for what is right. However, sometimes there's someone who actually has lived experience who could use their own voice. And so we need to think about how we want to use our voices, when we want to use our voices, and what our goal is. Because even if we have the best of intentions, it's not really about us when we're being allies. It's about the people we're being allies to. And so let's find out what they want. Let's find out how we can support. Let's find out how we can use our power and our privilege to create spaces, create better spaces, create more spaces for those who often are silenced in the conversation. This means not showing up for a hashtag or a picture at a protest, which we see a lot of people doing. One of the things that I think is interesting to see is that, you'll see on people's Instagram feeds that they'll post something really lovely about Black Lives Matters, followed by, another post about what they ate for lunch, followed by another post about something super random. Now, when we see things like that, they're not necessarily bad, but remember that allyship is about a lifelong commitment to building these relationships. And so showing up for a post, isn't that meaningful? Sure, you're part of the movement and that can be great, but that probably actually does absolutely nothing. And sometimes it makes us believe that we're doing something good when we're actually not doing anything at all. Part of being an ally is recognizing the role that we play with our privilege in allowing these oppressive these oppressive systems to continue to exist. And so instead of just showing up with a hashtag or showing up and taking a picture at a protest, how can we use our power and use our privilege and use our resources to support others? And this might be, creating space, facilitating. It might be using our resources to support, showing up in thoughtful and sincere ways, and continuing to learn. And when we're given feedback, trying not to respond in a defensive way, which can be hard, right? Because if our intentions are good and someone tells us that we're doing it wrong, it can be offensive. And yet it's not about us. And so let's remember that it's not about us. Being outraged at stories of racism and experiences of racism, it's not about you. So your outrage doesn't have a whole lot of space and sometimes takes away from really important conversation and really important movement. And so think about how you're using your voice. Think about who you're using it for, and thinking about how you want to show up for people who actually would like you to show up. And if people wouldn't like you to show up, maybe find out why and take some space and take the opportunity to learn. Now, all of this can be really hard and it can be complicated. And this is not necessarily meant to make us feel bad, right? Remember that we all have privilege. And so we can all show up in different ways. We can all use our privilege to decrease the systemic oppression that exists. But we need to recognize our privilege and we need to think about how we want to use it effectively in collaboration with those we want to support. Actions that happen on our own where we show up for people whose groups we don't belong to, that's usually not the best way. That's actually often how problems start, by thinking that you know what's better for a group than they know what's for themselves. And so don't do that. Show up and ask, show up and learn, be open to feedback. This is how we build these trusting relationships. And again, this is a lifelong process. Work on being anti-racist and recognize that one person's experience and what one person thinks is okay doesn't mean that it's okay for everyone. Know that there's so much diversity within groups, and the problem of racism started because people thought that everyone was grouped together and therefore had the same characteristics. So don't fall into that trap. Learn from multiple people and continue to learn and continue to recognize that we are all diverse and we all have diverse needs, and showing up means showing up for every single one of those people in the group to the best of your abilities. So I'll maybe stop there and invite folks to ask some questions. I'm also going to turn some lights on because I think it might be a little dark in here. That's a little better. So I received some questions early on, so I'll maybe start with those, but please do include some questions if you have any that would like to be answered. I'd also like to state that I'm not an expert in this. I'm constantly learning, I'm constantly growing, I'm constantly trying to challenge myself. I am not imperfect to being defensive. Um, and so I might not have the best answer. And if you want to contribute your answers or your perspectives, please do. And you can put those in the chat too, and I will try to share those with the group. So question number 1. Why is telling a Black, Indigenous, person of color to just let it go or get over it not helpful? So these are, again, situations in which we are taught to not hold on to the harm that's been caused to us, that our concern, our anger, our frustration, our sadness, our pain, they're all illegitimate, that we should just be okay with the pain that's inflicted on us and just get over it. But this is not helpful because it shuts down our experiences, it shuts down our pain, and it doesn't give room for it. It's us being told that there is no space for our pain and our experiences and our emotions, and there ought to be. And so when we tell folks to just get over it, we're not making space for it, and so that is unhelpful. Next question. Can you explain how being a person of color does not necessarily mean that you are not privileged? Absolutely. So like I mentioned earlier on, we all have privilege, and we all also exist in some sort of intersectionality that likely means we experience some oppression as well, for most of us, maybe not all of us. And so it's not necessarily that we are either privileged or we're not. It's complex, and it largely relates to the intersectionality of our identities. And so a person of color does not necessarily experience all of the privilege, but they don't necessarily experience none of the privilege. It's somewhere in between, depending on all of the identities and also a person's lived experience. The next question. How can I explain my experience with racism without having the people around me feel attacked? This is a great question. So often when we try to talk about racism with loved ones, especially if they are the ones who are making racist comments or gestures or behaviors, when we bring this up, people can feel attacked. And so let's think about how much emotional capacity we have and how much emotional labor we're willing to put into something. And so, for example, if someone wants to have a conversation with me about racism towards Black folks, I might have a little bit more capacity because I'm not the one directly being targeted by that. It's still exhausting, and it can be exhausting, but I can use my privilege to not be outraged, but rather to actually make space for a conversation in the hopes of being able to educate someone. If someone were talking to me about something that does feel more personal, in which I am feeling directly attacked, I might not have that emotional capacity to pause, to slow down, to have that conversation. So let's think about, instead of having attitudes of just being outraged and shutting down conversations and calling people racist, if we can, let's try to open things up and let's try to have those conversations. It's also important to think about whether the person on the other side of that conversation is even receptive to that. And if they're not, sometimes it's worth continuing to have the conversation, and sometimes it's better to save our energy to do the work without necessarily being brought down by someone who isn't going to allow us to express ourselves. Second part to that question, how can I listen to a loved one's experience without feeling attacked? And so this is a question about how do we decrease our own defensive reactions. And this is part of doing the anti-racist work. This is about the allyship, right? It's about recognizing that even though it may hurt our feelings, if someone told us that we hurt their feelings, in that moment, it's about them. It's not about us. And so often what happens is we actually use our defensiveness or our expression of feeling attacked as a way of countering the feedback that someone is trying to give us. And if we can realize that we are acting defensively, maybe we can pause, regroup, and come back to it and actually be open to that conversation. It's something that will be really hard to do at times. And yet, if we're committed to the cause, let's show up for it, right? Let's make an effort. Let's try our best. and let's see where it goes, right? There's always learning to be done. The other thing that I think can be helpful for both of these questions is recognizing that we don't always know people's intentions. And when we call someone racist, or when someone calls us racist, they're making assumptions about intention, which they don't know. And so instead of making it about intention, make it about outcome and impact, right? And so it's not you're racist and you're a bad person. It's, hey, what you said was actually hurtful to me, or to this person who's sitting here, or to this whole group of people. And then make that the conversation, so that the person doesn't necessarily put their guard up right away. People don't like to be told that they're racist, because people generally believe that they're good people. And for the most part, it's not people's intention to offend. So let's hope that for the most part, it's that people are uneducated and hopefully also want to be educated. Now, this is obviously not the case for everyone, but when we can be hopeful that it's at least the case sometimes, then it gives us a bit of room, and it gives us a bit of room for compassion. I see another longer question here. So I'm just going to read it out. Can you please share some tips on how we can hold healthy conversations in our homes, so with parents and partners, without being aggressive? Having transitioned out of my parents' home recently, I can finally see where the problem stems from. It all begins with identifying what is protection, why we're protected. So can you talk a little bit about how to deal with fear, or fearing of people who act violently? As I'm sure you know, many South Asian parents associate the Black community with violence. How do we have this conversation at home? As a mental health advocate, I am for change with compassion. This is a great question. You know, for so many of us, a lot of our initial socialization starts in the home. I mean, a lot of it also happens on TV, which isn't a great way to learn about how the world is supposed to work. But a lot of it happens at home. And so as we grow up and as we learn how to use our voices and we learn about our own values, it can be really hard to hear the people we love and the people we respect have very different attitudes, have hurtful or harmful attitudes. And so I think one of the things that we can try to do first is equip ourselves. If we come at these conversations with emotions as opposed to with fact, it usually doesn't go well. And so when we can understand how systemic oppression, how structural violence works, how intergenerational trauma works, when we can look at statistics around poverty and crime, when we can look at statistics of chronic illness and racism and some of the confounding factors to that, all of that information helps us have conversations where we can rely on facts. And when we rely on those facts, we're sharing, we're educating, and hopefully we're starting to shift some of the attitudes. Now, especially when it comes to parents or people who have maybe held these attitudes for a long time, they may not be ready to make significant changes in how they see things. And this can be frustrating for us as well. So let's remember that they've probably had a lifetime of being taught a certain thing, and we're not going to undo a lifetime of learning that thing in one conversation or in one experience or in one outburst. And so let's make the goals a little bit more reasonable, right? If we can teach the people that we love a little bit about how they're harming others or how they're misinformed, and we can do that in small bites that maybe they're willing to grasp, that then perhaps they can start to shift their attitudes, or maybe they'll use different language next time, and it still might not be the right language, but it'll be better language than they used last time. And you can continue to give them that feedback until hopefully at some point it doesn't harm. And then I think the other thing, although still not perfect, is how people interact in the home and how people interact in the outside world. In an ideal world, we would all have values of inclusivity, of respect, and of equity, and yet that's not the case. And so it causes less harm in the home than outside the home. And so even if you can convince your parents or your loved ones to not say that outside, or to speak in that accent to people, or to not use that language or make that assumption out loud in conversation, that in and of itself is a small thing that might have a huge impact. hopefully they'll realize why, and that'll change how they engage at home as well, but it might not. But the more that we can educate ourselves, so that we can educate others, the more we can actually connect with people who have lived experience and learn from their lived experience, the more we are equipping ourselves to have those really, really hard conversations. Okay, I'm just going to see if there are any other questions here before we wrap things up. And also invite, if anyone has feedback or has an opinion that they'd like to share, I'm definitely open to hearing it. I suppose that as I wait for some other questions to come in, I also want to say that when we think about violence and when we think about oppression, when we think about marginalization, um, we can be people who have survived that violence by group. So, for example, the colonialism of people living in India by the British. But then those same groups of people may have enacted violence on other groups of people. And so we need to be really careful about not necessarily positioning ourselves as victim or as survivor or as savior, because all of those things are so complicated. And yet those narratives are also the ones that help protect us sometimes. And so again, as we think about our identities, let's think about how those identities interact within ourselves, but also how they interact with other social structures and other identities, so that we can kind of make sense of the roles that our people or our groups have played and how they've affected others, and therefore how we want to position ourselves as allies as we navigate all of this. So before we end off, because I don't see any additional questions here, I do want to just talk a little bit about SILM Center for Mental Health. So SILM Center for Mental Health is a mental health center that is located in Toronto, Ontario. We're currently offering all of our services virtually. And one of the things that's most important to us is making sure that we're coming from an anti-oppressive lens. A lot of our therapists identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color. We have all experienced marginalization and oppression, and we bring that to the work that we do. And that's something that we really, really pride ourselves on, is making sure that we are meeting our clients where they're at. And so if you ever do need services, my screen sharing is not working today, but feel free to reach out. I think you can all reach me through this webinar. So that's one way. You can also reach out through emailing us at admin@silmmentalhealth.com, following us on Facebook or on Instagram, and reaching out to us through there. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining today. For a lot of you, you know that we've been having webinar series on different topics, and it's been a pleasure to be doing this with all of you. So please do stay tuned. Follow us on Facebook so that you can know what we're up to. We also have a YouTube channel, so you can subscribe to see the newest updated videos. And we look forward to continuing on this journey with you. Thank you all so much, and have a wonderful night.